I'm mostly a Pathfinder 2e creator, and a month ago I released some videos critical of the One D&D documents coming out, and I tended to be more negative than many D&D players on online forums were about them. This time around with a new document, I tend to be more positive. I don't know what's going on. Is this real life? I'm Ronald, the rules lawyer. This is the follow-up on my previous lawyer's critique video in which I summarized the contents of the second One D&D document on expert classes and pointed out things that you probably missed in that document. And this video is my critique of that document and on where One D&D is going. This video has 5 parts. 1, that this is a new edition, that this is the 6th edition of D&D. 2, that the drama online is rooted in Wizards of the Coast's current decision not to say that this is a new edition. 3, I unbury what I think are good design goals for One D&D as shown in this document. 4, I talk about the broader problems that One D&D needs to confront and face and my thoughts on those problems. And 5, what I think One D&D needs to do going forward. And after all that, I will tease a spicy topic that I think is intriguing and I think deserves its own video. I should introduce myself. I am a lawyer who runs tabletop role-playing games. I have run and enjoyed running D&D 5th edition, and my preferred system is Pathfinder 2nd edition right now. You can even say that I'm an advocate for Pathfinder 2e. At the same time, I also am an advocate for tabletop role-playing game players generally, and an advocate for demanding that Wizards of the Coast listen to and serve D&D players. First, it's hard to deny now what I've been insisting on for months, that this is a 6th edition of D&D, and that's a good thing. TTRPGs need to evolve, particularly when there are long-running complaints about your system, and that's healthy. If you don't evolve, if you don't adapt, you die, as evolution shows. In this new One D&D document, there are many examples of things that break easy use of 5e materials. There are some obvious ones, including just how characters are structured and that they start with a new feat at level 1, but also more subtle things. The change to 2-weapon fighting. If you are wielding 2 light weapons now, you can attack with both of them with your attack action, freeing up your bonus action, whereas that was not true before. It used your bonus action before. This alone changes the value of every bonus action in the game. Every spell that uses a bonus action, for example, and spells like Divine Favor, which gives you extra damage on all your weapon attacks during its duration. Also, we're seeing what some would call power creep, in which some options are being made more powerful than their previous 5e versions. And that's going to be a factor in take-up of this new edition. People will want the better version and therefore use the 6e version. And that combined with the fact that though they are made for the new system and don't require work to convert, people will tend to just adopt the new system. That is generally what people do when a new edition comes out, as I discussed in my previous lawyer's critique videos. And Wizards of the Coast has yet to acknowledge this is a new edition, which is having already negative effects on the One D&D process. They already are losing goodwill, inculcating mistrust, and causing a lot of panic about many of the changes. My overall impression and my prediction is that 6th edition is going to be a strict upgrade over 5th edition because it's a new edition. There are some long-standing issues about 5e that I will go into later that they can finally address. There's a promising concern for balance. There is a concern about preventing auto picks for some clearly optimal options, making more choices possible during character creation, and overall making the game more fun. But I have concerns that I'll say throughout the video. You may notice that I've been saying 6e, and that's what it should be called, 6th edition. It's the next one. And the convention of using 0.5 was only used once in D&D's history, and I'm not familiar with any other tabletop role-playing game that has this tradition. It was for the specific purpose of not pissing people off too much that the books for 3.0 that they had bought were replaced 3 years later. And editions are healthy. It's healthy for editions to evolve and improve and not be shackled by this dichotomy that it either has to be compatible with what was previous or break with what was previous. And say it's called 5.5, then does the next edition need to break compatibility to become 6.0? Or if it stays consistent with 5.5, will we start calling it 5.6? And is the one after it 5.7? Then we start taking up the same marketing speak Wizards of the Coast is using, and with no usefulness whatsoever. And we're maintaining this idea that a new edition, whole number edition, must involve redoing your entire system, which it doesn't. Just let the game be what it needs to be based on a frank and open dialogue with the community. The next thing I want to say is that the drama and the anxiety on D&D discussion boards right now about One D&D are rooted in Wizards of the Coast unwillingness to say that this is a new edition, which is leading to piecemeal releases and them hiding the design goals of this new edition. There's a lot of anger right now about this new document nerfing sneak attack and nerfing feats that were considered essential for marshals in 5th edition. And accompanying that, a concern that rogues are being nerfed overall, and that martial classes are being weakened further in relation to caster classes, which traditionally in 5th edition have dominated at many tables. I will go on record now that these nerfs generally are good things, that balancing of the game can still happen on a stronger foundation in which these nerfs happen. And actually addressing rogue weakness or marshal's weakness requires an overall approach, a system-wide approach towards the edition, in order to fix them. And because of the piecemeal nature of how these documents are being released, we're not able to see these changes to the classes and the feats in the context of other changes and other things that might be changing in the system that are needed to truly address the issue. So to speak about some of these nerfs, one of them is Great Weapon Master, which in 5th edition allows you to reduce your attack roll by 5 to increase your damage by 10. And this has been a feat that has been seen as essential for many martial builds in 5th edition to increase their DPR or damage per round. In the case of sneak attack, there was a possibility in 5e to have more than one sneak attack per round, which clearly was not the intention of the designers when they said you can have sneak attack once per turn. There are many builds that rely on triggering sneak attack by the rogue on a reaction, or using a cantrip like Booming Blade, or forcing an enemy to trigger an attack of opportunity by the rogue. And if anyone watching this thinks that that was an intention of the designers, I would just point to rules that have consequences very few people can defend, such as some of the invisibility rules, and Wizards of the Coast has not changed those. So there is a precedent for rules not having intended consequences that they have simply for some reason refused to change. What these two rules did was make it possible for a subset of players who enjoyed optimizing their characters to come to game tables with characters that clearly outclassed those who were not in the know, who didn't know the tricks or didn't look up an optimization guide on the internet. That has its own problems. So when designing the new edition, it's important to stamp out things that destabilize the entire design. In this case, DPR, damage per round. And on the basis of a predictable foundation, it is then possible to refine the design and balance the math. And you also need to make such changes before approaching balancing the classes. So there's anxiety about whether rogues can compete with the new rangers and whether martial classes in general can compete with casters. In the case of the Ranger, there's been discussions saying that the Ranger now takes up what were once tricks unique to the Rogue. But the solution is not to revert to where things were before and to give Rogue their sneak attack exploit again. It's probably found in weakening features of the Ranger or strengthening the Rogue in other places. This is a new addition after all. These are not patch notes to 5e. Not everything else stays the same. It might be time to let rogues have multiple sneak attacks per turn, just embrace that, adjust the math for how much sneak attack does, and possibly even give rogues extra attack like every other martial. Also, just much more goes into the balance of classes than just what's in the classes. Things like the power of certain spells. There are certain spells in 5th edition, especially save or suck spells, that can single-handedly win an encounter that martial characters don't have. And here in this document, we see a preparedness to revisit popular spells and nerf them in the case of guidance, which was a cantrip you could spam to get 1d4 added to every skill check in the game. But now it is limited to 1 per recipient per day. And also, even if martials are doing less hit point damage, maybe there's going to be changes in hit points to monsters. We actually don't know yet. However, what I do agree with in all of this anxiety I see online is a healthy skepticism of Wizards of the Coast's ability and even willingness to solve balance issues in their game. People who have followed Unearthed Arcana articles in the past, who took part in previous playtests, know what I'm talking about. The Twilight Cleric had an Unearthed Arcana article. It's a subclass of the Cleric and was seen as very strong by people who playtested it, and people gave that feedback. But when Tasha's Guide to Everything was released, the Twilight Cleric was buffed from its Unearthed Arcana version in the eyes of many people. Additionally, Wizards of the Coast not being frank about this being a new edition has rightly led to a lot of people to not trust Wizards of the Coast in general, another reason why I think they should correct their course. As for unbalanced things in 5e being left to lie and being produced in new books, I would argue that a lot of the imbalance to be found in 5e is in the player's handbook, and that you can't break what's broken. That may sound a little cruel, but yeah, there's less concern for balance, or it's less possible to fix the balance if you're not patching or errataing some things in the base books, which they have not been willing to do. One might even assume a nefarious plot that there has been an unwillingness to balance the 5th edition player's handbook and the system overall in order to give people a reason to migrate to the new edition. And so all the more reason why Wizards of the Coast should take this opportunity now to address lack of balance and the problems that poses for DMs in this new edition. Now, all of these things I've been talking about, addressing unintended interactions, exploits, possibly addressing disparities between classes, none of these things have been uttered by the developers or spokespeople for Wizards of the Coast.
We did a smart thing with 5th edition by listening to the fans. And what came out of that process was a system that is stable, that is well-loved, that incorporates the best elements of earlier editions. Now that we have that...
And that speaks to what I think the underlying problem causing all this drama is, which is Wizards of the Coast has been unwilling to say this is a new edition. They've been unwilling to say what their design goals are, because to say you have a design goal to fix something admits there's something wrong with 5th edition. You cannot fix something while not saying that there's something to fix. And so they have been trying to fix things, but these design goals have remained muted and hidden to the players. And there's this problematic vertical distance between the design team and all of us as to what those are. And what we're instead getting are monthly releases. In the case of the critical hit rule, something different every month. We're not being told why they're being tested in the first place, and we're being asked to upvote and downvote. The only feedback, if you can call it that, that can happen is a rule is released that people hate, they scream bloody murder, and it gets retracted. In the meantime, the prerogative of defining the goals of the edition remain the secret domain of the designers. The task of creating a new edition is a difficult one in which you want and need to be in an honest, frank dialogue with the players you're supposed to serve. If you want to have a coherent system in which classes and the base rules act in harmony to create a balanced, coherent system as a whole, you need to have design goals, and you need to, at times, juggle competing design goals. You cannot do that by simply asking people if they're satisfied or not satisfied by individual rules seen in isolation, and simply keeping the ones that piss off the fewest people. The original idea of these Unearthed Arcana articles seems to be giving us a snapshot every month of a specific aspect of the system, beginning with character creation. So first backgrounds and now classes. But one can't really evaluate individual things without knowing the greater whole, and especially without knowing why they're being made. And so in the case of sneak attack, it would help to know why this change is being made from the designers, and also know what other changes might be taking place. In the case of Great Weapon Master giving plus 10 damage being removed from Great Weapon Master, maybe there's a default action now that all marshals can use, or maybe use with a two-handed weapon in order to get that extra damage that doesn't require a feat. We're not able to evaluate these individual rules elements without knowing more. And a lot of the things in this document that are causing a lot of the most anger and anxiety right now are things for which I agree with the design goal, but I would say judgment of them is premature because we don't know enough. If this were a properly done playtest, the designers would be telling us that they do acknowledge and are seeking to address the disparity between marshals and casters. That statement alone would lessen the anxiety and freaking out about changes to sneak attack and other changes we're seeing in this document right now. People would be like, oh, okay, we know what they're trying to do. It's a little rough now, but that rule was kind of an exploit, and but now that it's gone, let's work on trying to balance the system. Another example is what people have called a nerf to the thief subclass for the rogue, their fast hands ability at 3rd level. No longer does it say that a thief can use an object as a bonus action. And I immediately asked myself when I noticed that change, oh, maybe it's a bonus action for everybody already, because I know that's a popular house rule with regard to potions, at least. Many say that using a potion now is a bonus action at their tables, even though that violates what's written in 5th edition. It might be that that house rule's become official. Again, we don't know. This all illustrates the ripple effects of not saying this is a new edition, of having a distance between players and never admitting there's anything wrong with your product while making a complete revision of your product is going to lead to communication issues. Now there's evidence that there is some turmoil within the One D&D design team, which I think is a good thing. Not necessarily internal dissension and drama, but shifting of gears from what their initial plans were. It was clear from the first One D&D document that they were seeing these documents as coming out pretty regularly once a month. That would give, as I said, snapshots of different parts of the system that they had kind of had an idea what it would be, and that there wasn't really an intention to get real feedback. This was demonstrated by what I talk about in my earlier videos, how it wasn't really designed to get real playtest feedback. It didn't help that the survey didn't even ask if people who used the crit rules actually playtested them, or actually playtested anything in the back half of the document in the rules glossary. The first document presented the crit rules in a way that wasn't going to get effective feedback. The crit rules changed in several important ways that I talk about in the previous video, but they only asked simply up or down, do you like the new crit rules or not? They did not say why the crit rules were changed, and two design goals that they had were, one, to protect lower level characters, two, to give monsters rechargeable abilities that recharge on a 20 instead of simply having double damage. And however, that was not known by many players. They also didn't ask players whether they thought these were good goals. Maybe they do want lower level characters to be protected, and maybe want it solved another way. In terms of monsters having rechargeable abilities, there were no stat blocks for monsters with such abilities for people to evaluate that with. And so with no motivation, no real true demonstration of the crit rules, and the bad way that they asked for feedback, people just downvoted it into oblivion. And it's not in this document, in the second one. There are small signs, however, that they are going to be more receptive to feedback. First, they extended the survey by 2 weeks. And that doesn't mean that they wanted more comments on that survey. I mean, most people were going to fill it in by the original deadline anyway. But what it meant was that they decided, what probably happened was they decided to delay the release of their second document and wanted more time to revise, perhaps even make entirely new sections to it. And that because they got feedback from the first survey that they didn't anticipate. Another positive sign is that Jeremy Crawford is saying that they are going to be re-releasing things from previous One D&D documents in future One D&D documents that reflect the feedback. And that is something that they have not said before. These signs show that there has been some turmoil, some surprises to the design team, and they are adjusting. And that, messy as it is response to feedback. It's not ideal. It's not the ideal way to get feedback, but it is responding to feedback. And this is not an endorsement of what they're doing right now. They can definitely improve. There were things in that crit rule change, reasons for it that may very well, maybe it was a good idea to give monsters rechargeable abilities, but we may never see that again because they were never upfront about the design goals and never gave us examples to actually work with, react to, and actually playtest. So there's the continuing problem of lack of transparency with the players that is hobbling this whole redesign process. For example, Jeremy Crawford made pretty clear that they're going to be releasing different versions of D20 test rules or crit rules in the future.
Over the course of the next year and a half, we're going to try out different versions of core rules and then see what people think of those different versions. A great example of this is how we're handling critical hits.
Yes. But so long as we don't know why they're making these changes, we're left to guess what problems these are trying to solve and not really able to interact with the designers. In this next part, I try to unbury the design goals of the One D&D team as exhibited by this second document, many of which I agree with and I think are good design goals. Before doing this, you may want to see my previous video in which I go over the contents of the document. The first design goal is to give players more ways to customize their character. So feats are now core and not a variant rule. So is the multi-classing. They also are giving level 1 characters feats. These all are reflecting how players have wanted to play 5th edition and often have played 5th edition. They wanted more ways to make their character feel unique and more toys to play with. Second is a big one, and I'll be spending a good deal of time on it, which is to give more balance to the system. It's important to understand that 5th edition was released in a rough form, even in its final form. Many things that are in the final player's handbook did not get much playtesting. feats and multiclassing are variant rules, and the game's math was balanced around not having feats and not having multiclassing. Not just the math, but monster design as well. And it was both assumed players would get magic items, but they'd be exceedingly rare. However, in some ways, the math was assuming no magic items also. And there kind of isn't a working system there. The majority of tables, pretty soon after 5e's release, however, have been playing with feats and multiclassing. Enjoy those parts of the game. Meanwhile, the base system wasn't designed to accommodate it, and the feats themselves and multiclassing itself were very rough in terms of balance, and they've lived on throughout the edition and have needed a revision to address a number of traps and overpowered exploits. The imbalance caused by feats and multiclassing used by most tables and caused by other parts of 5e creates a problem where you can have at the table some players who completely outshine others because of the combinations and choices that they've made. And it also means, ironically, for those who like optimizing and being powerful, that the meta is kind of stale. You almost always want to be a variant human or take certain feats like Great Weapon Master, Elven Accuracy, Crossbow Expert, and it should be more interesting. And most importantly, this lack of balance makes it hard to predict the power of a party of a given level. And this makes it hard for dungeon masters and also the game designers to balance encounters, to challenge players, and also make it possible for them to win. You're either threatening a TPK or it's something that they roll over. It's too easy. And it's not impossible to make a working encounter system in D&D, as shown by other systems. And I'm on the side of DMs. I think not only do they do the lion's share of the work, but also you can't have a game without a DM. And as explosive as 5e's growth has been, there is a shortage of people willing to DM because of the difficulty of DMing in 5th edition. So how are they trying to add more balance to the game? Despite some exceptions that are getting all the attention on the internet, overall, they are trying to buff weaker options to make them comparable to the power of the stronger options. So, for example, the Ranger, which was widely seen as a weak class in 5th edition, has now gotten a number of new features that make it more viable, especially in combat. And they also have spellcasting at level 1. For the Ranger's subclass Hunter, instead of having several options, some of which were weaker, they chose the stronger options, made that the one choice, and sometimes buffed that option. Also, Bards and Rangers are prepared spellcasters now. Generally, the classes that were limited to spells known were weaker than those who are able to choose different spells every morning, who are able to be more versatile. Now they're able to now it looks like all classes are able to do that. And also it looks like all casters are able to do rituals if they know a spell that has the ritual tag. Doing rituals is no longer limited to certain classes or people who take a feat. And we also see an effort to make the majority of feats, which were seen as weaker compared to a handful of essential feats, stronger so that they are viable alternatives. We also see a willingness to revisit spells that need some toning down, like Guidance, and I'm very happy to see that change, and because I think an essential part of making a working and fun encounter building system is to tone down some spells that I think are too powerful. I'm looking at you, Force Cage, Hypnotic Pattern, Shield, and Silvery Barbs. Also, it looks like, and I'm not sure how much will actually carry this out, there's also an effort to do what I call control the math. In 5th edition, there's a number of things that, such as the Guidance spell, which essentially gives 1d4 to all skill checks, many skill checks, the feats that gave you +10 to damage, that destabilized the math in the game and made it harder to predict what player characters are going to be capable of. Another example would be rogues having sneak attack. Some rogues will be exploiting the ability to have more than one sneak attack. Others will not. When you're trying to design a system and predict how much, let's say, damage a character is able to do per turn at a certain level, you want it to be more predictable. And there are ways to do that while still retaining options and customization for players. But you definitely want to stamp out things that are going to break your ability to balance. And these examples are things that would break that. Now, some would be surprised I'm talking about the taking away of +10 damage to marshals while talking about balance, because many are seeing this as a nerf to marshals. I would say, again, it's premature to judge that. It would be a nerf if it were patched to 5th edition. But like I said, and like Wizards of the Coast is not willing to say, this is a new edition, and there's going to be other changes, including possibly giving every martial character the ability to get extra damage, maybe if they use a two-handed weapon, I don't know. But also, even if you revert to 5e rules, there's going to be martial caster disparity. There's just other things you have to address, including you got to rein in some of the ways in which spellcasters can dominate. But that's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about at the moment. And I will say also that this effort to add more balance is also rough in this document. And okay, so I'm going to go through a list of problems that I found. So first, the Hunter subclass, which is seen as one of the weaker subclasses for the Ranger, if I'm not mistaken, is given a 10th level ability that is very weak. It makes the Conjure Barrage spell prepared by them for free. So every other Ranger already can prepare the spell, and when you look at the spell, it's not that impressive for 10th level. Next, we have the infamous nerf to sneak attack. First of all, I agree with the overall design goal, but the implementation here is rough. If you want to ready a sneak attack, which is very thematic, you cannot do that under this rule because that requires using your reaction, which is not during your turn. And also, rogues seem to fall behind the Rangers I've seen online. Rangers at 5th level get extra attack, and we'll also remember that now with the buff to dual wielding, they can now do 3 attacks with their action. And let's remember, Hunter's Mark adds extra damage to every attack that they do, whereas the Rogue's extra damage is limited to 1 attack during their turn only. So there are better ways to restrict sneak attack to once per turn than what's presented here. Also, I think it's time to consider not limiting the number of times you get sneak attack. Maybe we just want to give Rogue extra attack, tone down how much extra damage you get from sneak attack, so that it works more predictably and intuitively to rogue players. And yes, this is a little more like how it happens in Pathfinder 2e, but it's not wrong to look at what other systems do. And Polar Master just seems straight stronger than Charger, in my opinion, because it gives you a whole extra attack to which you can add bonuses. It also seems messy design-wise to have your ideal attack routine include a bonus action. I'll just put this out there. Giving you an opportunity to use a bonus action to do damage, that might need to go if we're going to remove that from dual wielding, because otherwise it becomes kind of essential for those who don't have a competing bonus action. Warcaster is also a strong feat that has been boosted, that gives now +1 to an ability score, that now gives advantage to all concentration checks while still allowing the previous benefits of letting you have your hands full and cast spells and do spells as reactions to creatures who leave your reach. Another issue is, while I appreciate the buff to dual wielding by making that second attack with a second light weapon not cost your bonus action, it's not clear how this will scale, because other fighters with two-handed weapons or a sword and shield, they're going to be getting extra attacks with that stronger weapon, which I assume will be doing more damage. And so that needs to be considered. And maybe damage per round isn't the only way we can improve dual wielding. Another design goal, I think, is to make the subclasses more focused and have more internal synergy. I like the fact that the College of Lore Bard improves bardic inspiration and grants a new ability, cutting words, that is improved by a bit higher level ability within the college. The hunter for the ranger needs work, but I like how there is a thematic focus on honing in and taking down a single foe. Another design goal seems to be to make actions use the actions the designers want them to, if that makes any sense. For example, in the case of bonus actions, they with dual wielding, they want that second attack to not take up your bonus action. In the case of the ranger, that's now freed up. The bonus action is freed up to cast Hunter's Mark and do other bonus actions, possibly cast Healing Word now. Again, while they're at it, I think they should have a character's normal weapon attack routine not use their bonus action. Free that up for fun abilities that are not simply part of your DPR routine. They've also defined actions like study, search, as actions, which some class features can turn into bonus actions. With reactions, it looks like they are putting more abilities out there that use reactions to encourage new players, I think, who don't always use them or find a way to use them. For example, Bardic Inspiration uses your reaction. So does the new Guidance spell. This is going to lead to some interesting choices as more things compete for that reaction, including Opportunity Attack. We may actually see some more mobility in combat if you walk away from somebody. That somebody needs to decide whether they want to use their reaction and prevent themselves from doing something as reaction later. It might even be a tactic to bait an opportunity attack from an enemy, and that would be cool. Another design goal we see is avoiding what I call feels bad moments, where you spend a limited resource and you see that it would not have affected the outcome. So you get to decide after a roll whether you add another die to it. So the big example is Heroic Inspiration. You now get to decide after a roll whether you want to turn that into a roll with advantage with Heroic Inspiration. Bardic Inspiration, you get to decide to use it as a reaction after an ally fails a check. Peerless Skill for the College of Lore Bard, you get to use after you fail an ability check, and Cutting Words is something you can use after an enemy succeeds on a check. We also see as a design goal more codification of certain actions, which I think is a good thing. Here we actually see most obviously influence of Pathfinder 2E, because the jump action seems to be the leap action, high jump action, and long jump action from Pathfinder 2E combined into one. And the study action has a use that is very much like recall knowledge in Pathfinder 2E. This has several advantages, and also I'm iffy on the implementation, which I'll get into in a second. But the advantages are that this lessens arguments between the DM and players. So let's say a DM has an environment that includes difficult terrain. The barbarian says, I leap over it and as I move forward. Now the DM can say, well, it actually costs you an action. Also, gleaning information about a monster now has a defined cost in the action economy. But there are things that I think can be done better here. For example, here it costs an action to recall an important piece of information, but it costs your action. And in the middle of combat, once initiative is rolled, this will disincentivize people using their skills. In reality, it's going to be that costly. Do I want to know whether the troll is vulnerable to fire, or will I learn it by throwing fire at it? Both will teach me whether it's vulnerable to fire, and in the second case of attacking it, I will also do damage. And so I think that this needs to perhaps be a defined bonus action. I'm not sure. Maybe these other actions that it seems like the designers want players to consider doing besides I attack should be bonus actions. That's something I think should seriously be considered. It kind of sucks right now that looking for an invisible enemy or jumping over something means you cannot attack or cast a spell on your turn because you've already used your action. Also, it's not clear to me what the intention of having influence be an action. Is it supposed to stop combats or get the help of a passerby who's neutral? I am not sure. Or maybe it's to make clear that you cannot interrupt a continuous activity like magic, which is defined as an action, and using your action every turn if it is a spell that requires more than one round of casting time. I'm not sure. And also, it's not clear to me why it's a charisma check instead of using your intimidation skill or your persuasion skill. It would seem this is a great opportunity to encourage players to use their skills. So those are the design goals that I gleaned from thinking, which were not stated by Wizards of the Coast, which they should state. And I think I like these goals, but they are rough in their implementation. And I do think they need to put some more resources into their writing of these. It's an ambitious project, writing a whole new edition, and you need a substantial team of people, people specializing in various areas and in communication with each other. It's a monumental task, and a number of these issues at the same time I found on a first read. So yeah, I think that there's a manpower issue as well. And some recent releases, Spelljammer, I'm looking at you, that I've heard a lot of discontent about, indicate that they could be putting more resources into their writing that they have the money for. It's Wizards that they're not doing. This next part is about broader problems that One D&D needs to face and confront. The first is that as One D&D tries to bring more balance to the game, they need to consider the tension, which is sometimes not reconcilable, between offering players more customization on the one hand and protecting niches on the other hand. There is a tension between customization and niche protection. In general, customization is good. You want players to have lots of choices. It's why feats are so popular in 5th edition. You get to make your fighter different from the next fighter. And at the same time, you don't want anyone to be able to grab anything. In this One D&D document, for example, the wizard is not able to take a number of feats by default, like fighting styles, because the fighting styles require proficiency in a martial weapon. The wizard would first have to take another feat to get that before taking a fighting style. This is an example of niche protection. I think the best comparison is Pathfinder 2e because I think it succeeds in giving customization while also fostering niche protection. Customization because you get to choose a lot of feats as you build your character and advance it, and niche protection because every time you get a feat, it's called something like a class feat or a general feat. A class feat has to be one of your class feats. If you're a fighter, it has to be a fighter feat. A general feat can be from a broader common pool. There are other kinds of feats too. What this does is it preserves class identity. The wizard is not able to take fighter feats like double slice and power attack, for example. Also, you get to avoid unintended interactions as well, such as in 5e, there's an interaction I don't think was intended, where spellcasters can take the crossbow expert feat and gain the ability to avoid disadvantage in melee when making ranged spell attack rolls. The other happy result of niche protection is that it allows you to give the choices exclusive to the fighter or to the wizard more power because it's only available to them. So, for example, the fighter has a 14th level feat that is called Whirlwind Attack. where they get to spend their whole turn attacking every creature within their reach. It's really fun if you have a polearm. In the hands of a wizard, that would arguably kind of, steal from the fighter, steal the fighter's thunder, while the wizard could still cast 9 levels of spells. One could see the problem there. And as some of you may be guessing, this problem of niche protection is very important to solving martial caster disparity, because you're able to give toys to martial characters that let them customize their characters, while at the same time walling off those choices to casters so that the casters aren't able to grab really neat toys and be the martial fighter as well. However, there is not much niche protection in this One D&D document. So a few examples. So the signature ability of classes that are in the expert group is supposed to be expertise. But the way multi-classing is working, you can do a level dip in rogue or ranger and get expertise. And let's say your character only really cares about 2 of their skills. You've taken the signature ability of the expert classes along with it. And also, very few feats here are limited to a class group. I only see the epic boons being limited to class groups. I could be mistaken, but this is an issue. For example, the wizard can take the lightly armored feat, which would give the wizard light armor training, medium armor training, and shield proficiency. And that is quite powerful. I believe that would mean that a level 1 wizard could have the same armor class as a fighter. And given custom backgrounds or just taking human from the first Unearthed Arcana document, any wizard can take this feat. Jeremy Crawford, in an interview in the spring, talked about feat chains. So we may see feats that have other feats as requirements that are higher level and require more investment. So that is something we may see in a future article. But having harder to achieve feats will not completely solve this problem if we're retaining how multi-classing is done in 5th edition and also how it was done in 3rd edition, which is when you take a new level, you can take a level in another class. Because right now there are some powerful dips that I see here, specifically the Ranger dip, which Jeremy Crawford seemed to have hinted at. The Ranger gets spellcasting, including Hunter's Mark, which doesn't count towards their prepared spells, which they can maintain without concentration, and they get proficiency with martial weapons and with medium armor and shields. With multi-classing the way it is now, the goal of niche protection is at odds with the goal of making level 1 more interesting, which I think is another design goal of this edition, giving Rangers spellcasting and some of their signature abilities at level 1 being the big evidence of that. I'll discuss some alternatives that might be ways at getting at this problem, but I think it's important for anyone who's watching to see how Pathfinder 2e does it, because it's how 4th edition does it, and it's in D&D's history, and I personally like it as a solution, which is that when you have your class at level 1, that is your class for your entire adventuring career. This frees up the design to give you your signature archetypal abilities for your class at level 1. You don't have to wait until a later level. Also, you get to take as feats abilities of other classes, and those feats give you specifically defined controlled things that from that other class. So the fighter, for example, instead of taking a fighter feat at level 2, can take a feat of monk from the monk archetype, which is what the multi-classes are called in Pathfinder 2e. And the monk archetype does not give you flurry of blows, which lets you make 2 attacks for 1 action, which is going to be very powerful in the hands of another class. They have protected that. That is in its own niche. That's something monks get at level 1. But if you, the fighter, want to get flurry of blows, you have to get it as a level 10 monk archetype feat. Also, your fighter can take more of those exclusive class feats that are only available to the monk normally by investing more in your archetype. As you level up, you can take a archetype feat that lets you have a level 1 or level 2 monk feat. And after you have that, you can take your third monk feat, something that gives you any monk feat that is 1/2 your level. So you can take any monk feat up to 10th level eventually, but not anything above 10th level. So what this does, it preserves a lot of choice, ability to choose, but it keeps things bounded in a way that you still get meaningful advancement from that other class, but you don't outshine that class. D&D does not have to abandon the way it does multiclassing to preserve niche protection. There are other things that can be done, such as, first of all, have feats that are limited to a class group. But if you want to take from another class group a feat, let's say there's a feat for warriors, and you're an expert, you have to be some number of levels above the level of that feat, or double the level of that feat. That's one possible solution. I don't know what the right answer is here. We have to see more of what they're trying to do with One D&D. But what is clear is that if they are retaining multiclassing, now is the time to address the power of level dipping in D&D. But retaining multiclassing is going to lead to some difficult design choices. For example, to prevent the power of level dipping in Ranger or other classes, do we want to make level 1 and level 2 less powerful, less distinct than players might want them to be? Also, we may get higher level feats in future Unearthed Arcana articles that are exclusive, say, to warriors. And do we want spellcasters to be able to nick those for themselves? Let's say wizards who currently with the shield spell in 5th edition can add +5 to their AC as a reaction. And let's say there's a feat like Whirlwind Strike from Pathfinder in One D&D, where you get to attack everyone in your reach. Do we want a wizard who has the shield spell to be able to just nick that and really be maybe one of the best fighters in the game? The freedom of choosing feats is a pressure on the designers to keep feats reined in and not become exploits. And that is something they might want to, that limitation is something they might want to cast off. Another possible solution is having every class have a signature ability that they get at level 1 that no other class can get by any means, unless using some expensive resource in their build. So let's say monks get Flurry of Blows at level 1, and no one else can possibly get that. I've seen some forums where people are saying that the Hunter's Mark spell should actually just be a class feature that is not a spell, so that the ranger can spam it throughout the day, not having to use their very few spell slots. And my first response to that is, whoa, that would be making this an even more powerful level dip. But if that were an exclusive level 1 class feature for the ranger, that would preserve the ranger's identity and prevent that from being nicked by any other class. That is something that I think the team should seriously consider. And related to that is my belief, I think shared by others on the internet, that the epic boons, the capstone abilities at 20th level, are kind of bland. They're not sexy, and they need to be sexy. And I think part of that is because they could be too powerful in the wrong hands. So let's take, for instance, okay, there is a rogue feat that's a level 20 capstone feat in Pathfinder 2e that makes it so that when you hide, you become invisible and undetectable by any means, including magical means, for basically the entire combat. And that would be very expressive what being a rogue is, and it'd be really fun to be a rogue doing that. But that could be too powerful in the hands of a fighter or a wizard, you name it. And also, I'm not sure I'm happy with the current groupings of the classes. They hew to 2nd edition AD&D. It's a nice symmetry, but I don't know if it makes sense for bards and rogues, a very caster class and a very non-caster class, to be together, because what would the feats for the expert group cater to? The obvious question is that it should cater to skills, but it has yet to be seen that skills would be made more vital and more useful in this system. But it seems like we are would be remiss not to have feats in the expert group that help a rogue hit things with their weapon and help a bard cast spells. Maybe one of the signature abilities of expert classes is to be able to take feats, some feats, regardless of what class group they are for. We get to another issue that I'm not sure if there are threads about this, but it jumped out at me, that ability score increases still compete directly with feats. It's been a common sentiment in among some 5th edition players that why not both? Why can't we increase our ability scores and choose a feat? Why do I have to have this choice between something that is arguably optimal? Some would disagree because there's some very powerful feats out there, your ability score, or something that's interesting, which would be a feat. And here we see that still being committed to in this document, because at 4th level you get a feat, and one of the feats is to get an effective +2 to your ability scores. It's just the same choice before in reverse, and it also feats are core. There's a couple problems here. First, there is that tension between choosing what is going to be optimal and choosing what's fun. We don't want that choice. Another problem is that you kind of have to plan your character ahead now. At level 1, when you make your ability scores, you need to figure out what your level 4 feat's going to be so that you can get that +1 that's attached to it. And if we were to divorce ability score increases from feats, we wouldn't have to make that advanced planning at level 1. And, you know, character creation shouldn't punish those who are not advanced planning. So the alternative would seem to be to divorce ability score increases from feats. And I would argue even from class levels altogether if you're keeping multi-classing. Your ability scores could increase, for example, every time you have a total of 4 levels and 8 levels and 12 levels and so on. Meanwhile, your class levels can give you feats. And also those feats will never increase your ability scores. Let's divorce the two. I acknowledge that one good design goal here is to help players who don't want to put much thought and look at a list of feats when advancing their character. To give them a simple choice, just let them choose an ability score, their main ability score to increase. I don't think that's necessary. I think a better solution is to force them to make a choice of a feat, but just give guides. Like, for example, if you are a two-handed weapon fighter, here are some things you should choose. Just as Tasha's gives some specific lists of feats and maneuvers that a fighter should take to express a concept they have in mind. The next broader issue is the big one, martial caster disparity. And my take on the martial caster controversy is different from most people's. Most people are focusing on how this or that feature or change in the document is going to affect damage output by martials. Again, I think a lot of the balance can be worked out. The math can be worked out over the course of the development, and there are some bigger issues involved. I would say my concern about martial caster disparity is that I think that martials should not have to be more like casters to compete with them. Historically, martials and casters have had a division of roles. In 1E and 2E a D&D, the warriors, the fighters, were tougher. They had more hit points. They were harder to hit. Their saving throws improved better than spellcasters. And spellcasters had a tough time to even just cast their spells. A single point of damage could interrupt their spell, which they had to declare at the beginning of the round before the martial attacks happen, and then their spells are resolved after the weapon attacks. Also, higher level parties tended to encounter higher level monsters, and in higher levels, your saving throws improved. It became easier to resist hostile magic and other things. So your 20th level wizard casting a spell, a death spell or paralysis spell against a 20th level monster, the monster only needs to roll a 3 on a d20 roll to resist it. What this means is that even to the higher levels, although casters generally could warp reality and are more powerful than martial characters in AD&D, they still needed the warriors, because if the enemy won initiative, they could blast a fireball or hit you with an arrow, and you're not going to get a single spell off. In Pathfinder 2e, there's also a division of roles. Marshals tend to be the kings of doing single target damage to bosses, and they're also generally tougher, whereas the spellcasters tend to be better at buffing, debuffing, supporting those who are doing the big hits, and doing area of effect damage against large groups. With 5th edition, we see that casters don't have the same limitations on them from AD&D days, and they arguably can do some martial things better than the marshals. The shield spell can give them better armor class. The Blade Singer wizard, many people find to be a better fighter than fighters are, and do more damage. And now, arguably, the limit on the number of spell slots the spellcasters can use in the day is the limit on them. And you are supposed to rely on the martial classes to handle a lot of encounters in a row. But the 6 to 8 encounter adventuring day that is assumed in 5th edition is not how the majority of tables play, and it's not sustainable in most realistic campaign settings. Now, what do I mean about making marshals more like casters? Well, the impression I got from Tasha's Cadron of Everything was that a number of the martial classes were being given more supernatural abilities, which is not a bad thing by itself, but the mechanics resembled more like spells. Like the Wild Magic Barbarian would have teleporting going randomly around the battlefield and other spell-like effects. And also the Psi Warrior would have mental attacks that they could use in battle that kind of looked like magic in play in the world. And also you were using psionic dice, which was twice your proficiency bonus that you recharge with every short rest. So you were tracking a resource, how many times you can use these special abilities. And so there was some bookkeeping involved, which some people who play martials don't want to do. Sometimes you want your marshals to just do their mythical abilities without it looking like magic, feeling like magic, and being tracked as a resource like magic. And meanwhile, we have changes to feats like Mage Slayer, where, okay, let's remember in 5th edition, you cannot disrupt a spell that's being cast, even if you ready an action. But Mage Slayer in 5th edition at least had the ability to react to a spellcaster by hitting them. And it would force a concentration check if they have a spell that requires concentration. Now Mage Slayer has removed this ability to make a free attack on the spellcaster. I'm thinking maybe it's because of the new monster design. They don't want monsters to have actual spells. They want to have not spells that function like spells but are not spells that can be counterspelled. That was a word salad. And maybe they want to also buff it by letting them once per day turn a failure on a save against a spell into a success. Meanwhile, there in the rules glossary, teleportation, it's now made clear to us, will never ever provoke reactions. So Misty Step to get out of someone in your grill is now never going to be countered by a marshal. And as you can see, I'm not looking kind of in the abstract at the damage output of martial characters and comparing their ability to shut down enemies to those of casters. that's not the only issue involved. What is being moved away from is the ability of a marshal to shut down a spellcaster, which has been key in the history of D&D. Traditionally, the way to stop a spellcaster is not to have your own spellcaster and be in a wizard's duel or to counter their counter spells. It's been to beat them to death. That's how you stop a spellcaster traditionally. And I think that is the purview of the marshal. It's their privilege. I don't want the solution that they come up with for marshals to be, if you can't beat them, join them. Meanwhile, yes, there should be ways for rogues, and especially now in this new document, and marshals generally, to increase their damage to offset some things that have been lost to them in this document. Some of those may be in rules for weapons or actions that we have not seen yet because they're in future articles. Regardless, I think we need to be shown some more snazzy martial feats, things like a whirlwind strike, other things that you see in high-level Pathfinder class feats for marshals that make people excited to play martial characters, that can also be done throughout the whole day, that let them excel in that sphere in a long adventuring day. And it will also help solve the attrition, expectation of attrition through 6 to 8 encounters per day that DMs feel forced to do currently in 5e in order to challenge a party. Another thing I noticed is that we don't have unique spells for classes, which I thought was promised by Jeremy Crawford. I could be mistaken in that. What we have instead is unique class spell lists only by omission. So the Bard has access to the arcane spell list, but only 4 of the spell schools. And the Ranger has access to the primal spell list, but not access to evocation spells. And this just seems like a missed opportunity and an opportunity to foster more class identity, feeling like your class. For example, we could have songs that only bards can cast, and the higher level songs can only be accessed if you have enough levels in bard. There are spells or capstone abilities for bards in past editions where you kill somebody with your song, and I think that's also an option in Pathfinder 2e, and that's cool. And also Hunter's Mark could be a class spell for rangers that might get other benefits as you have more ranger levels. There's this whole design space to make cool spells that you only want a certain class to have, and that shouldn't be closed off. Another issue I found is something I've said in previous critique videos, which is that long rests, if they're interrupted by a combat, you have to start your long rest over. So imagine resting for almost 8 hours and some wolves enter your camp just before dawn. You're going to lose most of the next travel day. And if you contrast this to how other editions have handled it, in 4th edition, if you had a combat, or had some other interruption, it just lengthened the length of your long rest. And in Pathfinder 2e, you add 1 hour to the time. And this is much more punishing. Maybe they're doing this to force parties to use their daily resources to help DMs reach 6 to 8 encounters per adventuring day by forcing players to encounter them. And remember, they're going more in the direction of having abilities recharge on a long rest, so this would be consistent with that. But this is a crude solution, and something I have not seen anyone else raise, and I think is a problem. Now we get to the last part of this probably long video, where I talk about what One D&D should do going forward and problems they have yet to address. First, the survey. They need to do some things that they failed to do last time. They need to ask people for feedback on some broader decisions that they made here. For example, do people want feats to compete with ability score increases? They need to ask that question. And if they don't ask that question, then I question this being a true survey and a true effort to get feedback. Second, they need to ask people who give feedback on the rules glossary whether they actually play tested those rules when asking them what they think about those rules. If this is an actual play test, they will figure out and separate out the opinions of those who are voting simply based on what they read, and those who actually tested things in action, whose feedback should be given more priority. Third, they need to ask people whether they are DMs versus players, because DMs are the ones who build the hobby, and you can't play without a DM. And just by numerical advantage alone, players will drown out the voices of DMs, and you want to hear especially what DMs have to say. Fourth, you want to not simply ask people if they're satisfied or unsatisfied by something. You want to get deeper, and you also want to be transparent about your design goals. And I think it's very useful to contrast how we've seen wizards do their surveys and how Jeremy Crawford responded to the rogue surveys in the past, to how Paizo is doing its surveys for its current playtest for the kineticist, which is like a bender, someone who manipulates energy. And okay, to look at what is in the kineticist questionnaire, they ask if you've actually played it, whether you're a GM, what levels you played at, if you made a kineticist, which options did you choose, which elements did you focus on, which options did you take, which options do you think are the most powerful at each tier. So they were actually tracking the choices people were making in their builds, and they listed various features and asked them not only how much were they satisfied by them, but did you find them interesting? How much? How interesting? Did you find them powerful? How powerful? And did you find them easy to understand, those features? And there are a couple of questions that put design goals explicitly before the players and asked them to choose between them, and explained why some choices were made in the playtest. So this question says, the kineticist was designed to work primarily like a martial character, to give it a distinct theme different from spellcasters, and to avoid some complex spellcasting rules. Do you prefer this or a structure more like existing spellcasters? Now, the kineticist was in Pathfinder 1st edition, where you accepted burn in order to power really showy abilities, but was a resource you had to track over the course of the day. And this playtest decided to let you gather power at will by spending an action in your turn. And they ask people directly, the playtest kineticist uses gathering an element to determine which impulses they can use. This is to reduce long-term tracking, to take advantage of the 2nd edition action economy, and to make them play differently from spellcasters. The 1st edition kineticist took points of burn to fuel many of their talents, allowing for bigger effects or long-lasting ones at the cost of reducing the kineticist's maximum hit points for the rest of the day. Which do you prefer? In contrast, in one of the interviews for this One D&D document, Jeremy Crawford said that the feedback that they got for the various classes showed that there was a lot of satisfaction about the rogue.
We, within the past year, we did a big survey of asking people their satisfaction with not only all of the classes in the 2014 Player's Handbook, but also all of the features in those classes. And one of the things that became super clear about the rogue is almost everything in this class is beloved.
Okay.
And so people are going to see in this playtest fewer things have changed in the rogue than in, say, the bard or the ranger. The rogue is so solid in the 2014 PH, and again, so beloved, that what you're going to see here is a sequence of careful refinements rather than sort of big swings. Because when we looked at, hey everyone, what do you think? Most of what we saw, and in some cases the satisfaction levels from the thousands of people who took those surveys were in the 90 percentile range. Like some of the rogue features were like 95% satisfaction, 96% satisfaction.
And so in contrast to what they would do with the ranger, who they decided to boost, they decided to leave a lot of things intact for the rogue, and even nerf things in case of sneak attack. And The problem is that level of satisfaction didn't tell them what they needed to know, because that could have meant a number of things. It could have been what they thought it was, that they were happy about the level of power in the rogue. But they also could have just expressed that they really felt like a rogue while playing a rogue. It really made them feel like they were doing something other people couldn't do. I think the cunning action class feature is behind that. And that's a completely different thing. And so they need to make sure that their survey is actually giving back useful data if they seriously want feedback. And my criticism of the first survey stands, and I maintain my skepticism that they truly want to open the gates to feedback, which would mean revisiting some things that they've decided in advance will not change because this is not a new edition. And hopefully this will change. We will see. Also, they seem to be planning to release the other class groups, the warriors, the mages, the priests, in the next Unearthed Arcanas, and I think that would be a bad move. I think we're going to see more drama like in the current one. We need to see more what they're trying to do with the overall system. Are they trying to balance spells, for instance? We need to start seeing some more changes to spells. We also need monsters to playtest these things against. We also need to see more higher level feats. Maybe they haven't had time to develop them yet, but I think higher level feats that do things like whirlwind attack would generate lots of hype and make people excited about playing martials and address some of the anxiety about martial caster disparity now. And you can't really evaluate the classes without knowing what feats they can possibly take. Lastly, there's a number of problems. Well, they haven't acknowledged they're addressing any problems yet. There are problems, elephants in the room, shall we say, that Wizards has yet to begin to address. Things like the magic item economy, or lack of one, more accurately, in D&D. Rules for crafting that are good. Having the Adventuring Day problem, in which DMs feel like they have to have attrition and have lots of filler encounters to get to really challenging encounters. And it's not assuring to hear that Wizards is trending more towards daily resource abilities that recharge on a long rest. The ease of encounter balancing. This is a big one. I plan to have a video on this at some point, but yeah, the fact that somebody can post in Reddit that they no longer track hit points for their monsters, and their players are telling them that they've had the most fun, most balanced encounters they've ever had in a D&D game is a problem, indicates a problem. And we have a situation where DMs feel like they have to cobble together the appearance of difficulty while granting, in reality, assured victory to their players. And it's a big burden and something that the system should be able to make easier by simply tuning things up and down in an easy way. Then another problem is fixing the math of the game, which I think is its own video also. They actually don't follow their own design in 5th edition, and I will make the case for that in the future. The death and dying system brings with it its own problems that people have complained about. It's too easy to die at low levels, and it's arguably too hard to die once you reach level 5, when Revivify and other things come in. And there's the oft complained about issue of people being brought up to 1 hit point only and being knocked out, having little consequence. And here's a big one. Some spells are overpowered and single-handedly shut down encounters in a not fun way. There's a time and place for them, but some things went beyond even what I think the 5th edition designers intended. There are some unintended overpowered spells, I believe, even. And that needs to be addressed, and that's going to lead to a big flip out if they plan to address it. And it's time to address it now and not months from now. And making levels 1 to 2 more fun is another, and making higher level play workable. Basically, we're seeing a lot of new toys for players in these Unearthed Arcana articles, but we're not seeing, besides the work on balance, which, as I said, has been rough, we're not seeing much work being done to make the game easier to run for DMs. And Dungeon Masters are the people you want to win over. They're the ones who do the work, they're the ones who make games possible, and they're the ones who can decide to switch their group to another system if they feel they're not being served. At the end of this video, I'm going to tease a topic that is spicy, that I think deserves its own video, and will spur a lot of good discussion, I think. And it will be the topic of my next One D&D video, but I think I'm not sure when that's going to come out. I am going to put out a Pathfinder video next. Before I do that, I'm going to do my outro. I am Ronald, the Rules Lawyer. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and support my Patreon. My Patreon is how I'm able to continue doing what I love, which includes making these videos. And I don't get paid as a lawyer. And join my Discord. We have a great community there. In this One D&D document, there are definitions of jump, study, and search. And I like what they're overall trying to do here. They're giving us more defined ways to use our skills and more things to consider to do in combat that are not simply attacking and casting a spell. However, they compete with attacking and casting a spell. If you want to jump, you cannot attack that turn. If you want to study an enemy's weaknesses, you cannot cast a spell that turn. And we should be able to do more than one thing, or be able to do them both somehow. And I think it's time. I think it's time for Wizards of the Coast to start considering